Yeah, I mean, the period after 9/11 was kind of strange looking at the West's relationship with Bashar al-Assad because you had public and private statements that the West wanted to overthrow him, and you saw this not just in the private communications between U.S. government officials, but also, I mean, there was a interview that Assad did with CNN where they essentially said, we're looking to overthrow you soon, which is a little bizarre.
Mr. President, you know the rhetoric of regime change is headed towards you from the United States. They are actively looking for a new Syrian leader. They're granting visas and visits to Syrian opposition politicians. They're talking about isolating you diplomatically and perhaps a coup d'etat or your regime crumbling. What are you thinking about that?
I feel very confident. For one reason, because I was made in Syria, I wasn't made in the United States, so I'm not worried. This is Syrian decision should be made by the Syrian people, nobody else in this world. So we don't discuss it in Syria.
What would happen, do you think, if there was an alternative to you? Who is the alternative to you?
Could be any Syrian, any national Syrian, and we have a lot. I'm not the only person who is eligible to be president. We have a lot of Syrians, so we don't have any problem about that. But no Syrian would be allowed to be president if he's made anywhere outside our borders. This is a Syrian principle.
At the same time, you had Assad visiting with the Queen of England. You had, and something that I always thought was strange about the criticism of Tulsi Gabbard going to Syria was that around this time, Nancy Pelosi was meeting with Assad. John Kerry had dinner with Assad.
Yeah.
So it was this very strange kind of extending of an olive branch, seemingly, but also like threatening to destroy Syria. Could you just speak to this a little bit? I mean, I imagine from the Syrian government's perspective, this must have been quite odd.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Around 2002, he met the Queen. Tony Blair was talking about bestowing an honorary knighthood on him. And I mean, I would say even leading up to 2011, there was a book by an American academic, David Lesh, the Bashar al-Assad, the New Lion of Damascus, and I thoroughly recommend that everybody looks it up and reads it. Because again, this was part of the kind of the courting procedure. This was an academic who shadowed Bashar al-Assad for, I think, around 2 years before writing a book about a very reformist, a very progressive president who was, a good ally for the democratic West, etc. Of course, post 2012, he wrote a book that did a complete U-turn on that characterization of Assad. But even while Assad was being courted, of course, there were, let's say, undercurrents of threat, as you rightly say. I mean, I can't find the actual quote, but Blair was basically saying, as far as Iran and Syria are concerned, when we come to weapons of mass destruction, if they don't deal with it, then of course they'll be isolated or worse. And of course, we know in Syria, the weapons of mass destruction is the chemical weapons. The weapon of mass destruction narrative that was used to destroy Iraq has been converted into the chemical weapons narrative that is, since 2018, has been severely discredited and demonstrated to be another weapons of mass destruction construct to maintain the criminalization and demonization of the Syrian government. And 2003, of course, and this is where the threat, in my view, started to kind of come in, because probably Assad wasn't entirely towing the line. 2004, you had, at that point, BBC Media Action started to, let's say, scout for opposition, for viable opposition inside Syria, under the pretext of providing media assistance, etc. I've actually had a fairly gladiatorial exchange with Juliet Harkin, who was the former BBC Media Action project manager on Twitter, where she tried to defend her actions and said that, you know, BBC media action has nothing to do with regime change or infiltration. But of course, that's proved wrong by their history. So in 2004, the BBC were, in my view, sent to scout for viable opposition members that they could infiltrate and influence in order to turn them against the Syrian government. And I also know from ministers, either current ministers or spokespeople of the government, etc., officials from the institutions, that they were being approached from around this time onwards with financial incentivization to come over to the Western side. So this is, you know, this is nothing new. The former foreign minister was offered multiple bribes. Buthaina Shaban, who's the media advisor to the presidency, was offered multiple bribes, even prior to 2011, to come over to the dark side, to the side of the US coalition. And in 2004, so at the same time as the BBC was scouting for opposition, President Bush imposed severe sanctions on Syria on the basis that they were supporting terrorism, which included, of course, Hezbollah and Hamas, which were the biggest threat or the biggest nemesis for Israel in the region. Many people believe that these sanctions were also punishment for Syria's not supporting or opposing the war against Iraq.
Well, one thing that I think is forgotten in the United States is how strong the anti-war sentiment of the mid-2000s was, because you had massive demonstrations around the world, really, prior to the invasion of Iraq. But in 2005, 2006, you would see hundreds of thousands of people protesting. Cindy Sheehan, she made a lot of headlines in her protesting George W. Bush. The Democrats ran on 2001 in 2006 and 2008 by running against the Iraq War and pretending as though they were going to end the Iraq War. I know that in the lead up to the Iraq War, Wesley Clark said that he was shown a memo that we were going to invade 7 countries in 5 years. Obviously, that didn't come into full fruition, although we did bomb Libya and Syria. I guess I'm just wondering, do you think that strong global anti-war sentiment against the neoconservatives and the Bush administration, do you think that prevented an invasion of Syria in the mid-2000s and perhaps other countries?
Well, that's an interesting question, not something that I've really thought about. I don't think so. I don't think it had any effect at that time, because I think at that time, looking at the emails and the communiques, I think the US and the UK thought that they could bring Bashar al-Assad over to their side. I think from around 2003, 2004, as I said, onwards, and as you said, I mean, there was that bizarre interview with Christiane Amanpour for CNN where she basically said, yeah, we're planning regime change. And not forgetting also in February of the same year, Rafiq Hariri was assassinated in Lebanon, which was then conveniently blamed on Syria and Hezbollah. And of course, no investigation into the covert operations carried out by Mossad, the Israeli intelligence. So I think no, because I think I could be wrong, but I would say that because a lot of the building up to the war in 2011 was very much covert and very much clandestine. I mean, it wasn't launched with the chemical weapons attacks. It was launched as part of the Arab Spring. And I think, a lot of people, sadly, on the left were very confused by this entire Arab Spring. It's a clever concept because it fooled a lot of people on the left. So no, I would actually say, because a lot of it was not visible, I mean, you had, I suppose, in history, you had the Israeli clean break strategy, which was talking about using the invasion of Iraq to roll back Syria, weaken Syria. There were comments from US State Department officials, neocons, that you know, the road to Damascus goes through Baghdad. So to some degree, the invasion of Iraq was an inevitable part of the eventual invasion of Syria. But I think at that point, they were probably hoping from a brinkmanship perspective that the invasion of Iraq might intimidate Syria enough to bring it to heel, to bring Bashar al-Assad to heel, and then they could incentivize and use a mixture of incentivization and coercion to bring the Syrian government into line, but it didn't work. And so I think from 2004 onwards, we started to see, you know, in 2006, there was the article in Time magazine called Syria in Bush's crosshairs. And even then it was talking about the fact that the Bush administration had been quietly nurturing individuals and organizations that might be effective in toppling the Syrian government. So I think from then onwards, we started to see, you know, the WikiLeaks released documents from the CIA in 2006, etc., demonstrating that, yeah, they were planning to again weaponize and instrumentalize the Muslim Brotherhood, as they have throughout the history of these CIA interventions. They did in 1949, in 1956 from memory, in 1978, in 1986. So, I mean, this is, in 1986, it was an almost textbook copy of what happened in 2011, as it was in 1978. So, but I think the left was caught unawares, to be honest. And actually, they've been kind of pretty disappointing for opposing the war against Syria in general. I think they've been very confused by the narratives that are coming out.